Hello and welcome back to the Blush Studio. We're going to do a continuation of this illustration that I did earlier this year for you. I just did the contour though, and I didn't do the shading portion in that video. So I've decided to continue that video due to many requests from you in showing you the shading portion. If, however, you're interested in kind of how to illustrate the contour and just some drawing tips in general for me for drawing realistically, I'll have that video linked down below. So for this illustration, I am working with a Micron 01 pen, and that's what I used for the contour. And I'm going to switch between that and my 005, I believe. I'll show you when I actually switch. And I'm just kind of slowly shading in, following the contour that I had. So I had a lot of fuzzy texture for this guy, and I wanted to kind of follow that with this, the same way I did in the illustration that I showed you originally. So I'm just kind of starting at where there's a transition and where there's just going to be more texture, and I really want to emphasize that with a darker collection of lines. So that is one great way to create emphasis naturally, is to have a darker area. And so you'll see kind of in between the different areas of his body, the different sections that make up his body, I'm just going to get darker. Now let's zoom in a little bit more here, just so that you can see just the difference in what I'm working on. So I'm doing kind of what's called cross-hatching, which is where I'm building up the texture in two different directions. So rather than having all of the lines go in one direction, which is generally referred to as hatching, which you can see is usually how I start. So all of those are diagonal from the upper left down to the lower right. But then eventually I'll build it up by cross-hatching and just going in a different direction. This just helps to darken everything without having like a buildup of lines that get just too dark, and kind of helps to keep everything nice and even. Oh, there's some cross-hatching there just to kind of deepen that area. The trickiest part with this bumblebee is having consistent shading with these different areas of value. So obviously with a bumblebee you have the lighter stripes and then the very dark stripes. So I usually start by going in with areas that are going to be darker, just as I'm kind of really building up this just more comfortableness with the media and just getting a little bit more familiar with how I want to shade each piece, because I just find that even though I have a pretty standard technique and it's pretty consistent throughout my illustrations, each piece has its own quirks and has its own challenges. And so even though, again, I approach with kind of the same philosophy overall, I want to make sure that each piece has its own opportunity to have its problem solved in the way that it needs to be done, and yeah, it just needs to be tackled differently depending on what you're illustrating. So to me, since shading really isn't my main form of illustrating, I always start with the darker areas, because if I make a mistake, that area is going to be built up anyway, and so it's not going to be as obvious. So again, just continuing to build this up. I know that his head overall is going to be dark, but I want there to be a highlight there to help show that this is a little round creature rather than just a flat object. So that is in art terms called modeling, and I'm just slowly building that up around the contours, around the edges of this little body. So, and I'm jumping around a little bit just because, again, I'm trying to feel out how this little guy needs to be filled in. Even though I just did a similar bumblebee, this one is going to have different quirks, and I'm looking at the photo for a reference. I will have my exact reference photo that I used to illustrate the contour and to shade linked down below for you. Just like the other one, it was illustrated from a Pinterest photo, and which is generally how I like to work. I usually find things on Pinterest and then work from there. And usually it's a couple different reference photos. Sometimes it's not. In this case, it was pretty much just the one. And so you'll be able to follow along with me and to create even a better illustration based on that photo. Now again, I'm going to jump around here a little bit. The antennae, I want those to pop out against the shaded flowers behind that. And so I did have the antennae pretty dark in the original illustration, but I definitely wanted to pretty much fill it in completely this time. Same thing with the legs. On the previous illustration, I kept those light. I just liked the contrast and then it wasn't too heavy below the actual body. But again, because this bee is on these flowers, these, I think they're, what kind of flower is that? I don't know. I'm having a little blank moment here. But because this has so much activity behind it, I want it to pop up towards the viewer. So I'm going to make it dark almost completely. So again, I'm working from the sides because I want to make it look round and I'm working on that modeling. But I'm keeping in mind this illustration is unique, and in order to make it really visible for my viewer, which right now is you guys, but really anybody who sees this illustration after I'm finished, I want to make sure that there is that differentiation in value, which is, value is just a fancy word that means how light or dark something is. So again, kind of following the same formula for each of them. I know that the right side is going to be a darker shadow because that's going to be closer to the ground and farther away from the sun. But I also know that because I want to show that it's round, I'm still going to be modeling the top half as well on the left side of the leg. So just slowly building that up, and again, I'm going to go back and forth a little bit between each of these just as I realize, you know, this technique works a little bit better. Let me do that with the rest of the legs and just kind of building them up and keeping them consistent. So stepping back for a moment just to see how it looks, you can see now the legs are very dark. I'm going to have to continue building up the color elsewhere because I don't want it to look like the legs don't belong on this illustration, that they're just kind of like holes in my illustration. I want everything to be nice and consistent. And just so you know, this video is complete real time. I just turned on my phone and started filming, and I downloaded the video onto my computer and I'm doing the voiceover now. So it has not been sped up at all. Some illustrators are faster than this, and you might be one of them, but some are even slower, and that's okay. Just kind of take your time with this, especially if you're new to shading and trying to figure out what exactly your style looks like, or again, each item that you illustrate, especially when it's around different subjects. So like this one has the flower, my previous one was alone and kind of flying, if you will. That will change how you illustrate things, just because you want to make sure that you're communicating well with your viewer, which is one of the main goals of illustrating in general, and one of the biggest hurdles to kind of overcome is just finding out, okay, how do I communicate what I'm trying to show you without words, and the fact that this isn't an actual three-dimensional object. So that's what I'm just trying to do slowly with this illustration. You'll see that once in a while my pen will pause or my hand will move back just like that, and that is just me looking back, taking a moment to reassess the illustration. I usually, especially if I'm working for a client, I always schedule in one kind of rest day. I need to have a day in between, or just some time in between, whether it's just a night or several hours, where I can just step away from the illustration, get out of my own head, and then come back to it with fresh eyes and see some things that I might not have noticed there before. So there you can see that little line that I just kind of slowly cross-hatched in. That's just me differentiating the top section of the body, kind of the torso area, with the lower section of the body. So now I'm going to put away the 01 pen, like I mentioned earlier, and take out my 005. So this one is just much more fine, it's smaller. So I can go in a little bit more aggressively with some of these lines, and they're not going to show up quite as heavy. With the original illustration, I did it all with the 01s. There's not really a right or a wrong. I just felt like I needed to be able to build up some of this texture and some of this value in a little bit slower. So that's why I went for the 005. So again, just building that up. I'm really focusing, kind of that last couple of strokes was me really trying to differentiate the different stripes and just the transition between them. When you don't really want that area to be fuzzy, you want to, again, show your viewer, communicate clearly that this is a clear transition. This side on the left, that is going to be a light color or a yellow if I were to color this in. And then the area on the right of the line that I just did is going to be much darker and have a lot more of just a different emphasis. And then to help that wing to pop, because it is so much thinner than the wing on my previous illustration, I'm just shading underneath it, just adding a little bit of definition, which will also help it to kind of be raised above the bumblebee. So instead of being very flat or pressed against it, it looks like it's hovering above his body, which of course it naturally would do. So slowly building, one of the hardest things that I noticed with this illustration was to keep the texture of just kind of his fuzziness, which we talked about in the previous illustration. So again, I'll have that video linked. I actually recommend watching that one before this one. So hopefully you were able to do that. But staying true to that and keeping that texture without messing it up with the shading. So that I found to be really tricky this time. I don't remember that being a problem last time, but sometimes things that you don't necessarily expect to be a problem are kind of a problem. And so like if that's you, like if something that you really didn't expect to have an issue with or something that I didn't have an issue with, suddenly you have trouble with, don't worry about it. Every illustration is different and has its own quirks. So for some reason this time, keeping him really fuzzy and just having it at a level that I felt like was consistent and communicated his texture without being distracting. I don't know, I just struggled to keep that this time. I felt like I kept almost erasing it, and that's just, I would have to like go back in and kind of fix it. So something that I needed to work on a little bit this time, and I'm glad I had an opportunity to do that and to just grow my artistic abilities. So back to the 01, I'm kind of going around and trying to make sure that everything is as deep and defined as I want it to be. And I think I actually jumped back to the 005 just then, so who knows what pen I'm using. I just kind of, like based on what I'm kind of feeling, I'll just switch pens. I'm usually a single pen or a single pencil person, but once in a while, when, just like if you're painting, you just kind of get in the zone and you just work off of that. Work off of what you know instinctively that you need. So going back to the 01, going back over the legs to make sure that they didn't get lost with the extra shading. I'm happy now with the fact that I don't feel like they're sticking out like sore thumbs, where when I first filled them in, they just were too dark in comparison with the rest of the illustration, but I still want to make sure that they are nicely defined. And now, looking back at the composition as a whole, I feel like this floral element is getting a little bit lost. So I've decided to deepen the stem so that it just kind of helps to, this way it just emphasizes the direction that it's moving in, but it also gives it a little bit more presence and it kind of grounds it. Do you see how I had like my hand open? That is kind of that's actually what I'm doing as I'm talking to you. That's just kind of how I symbolize being grounded, and so sometimes you'll see me do that and when I'm illustrating and it's just me kind of talking to myself. I don't like, however, on the left side there's this negative space here, and so I'm going to add another element of just this flower that is actually not in my photo, but I decided to add it because I felt like that was, I don't know, it was just getting distracting. ink that guy in. And I do want to keep it nice and light because I want it to be in the background, but because, again, I just felt like there was too much negative space there, especially with that larger flower pointing left, that it was just drawing your eye away from the composition, which I definitely did not want. I'm just going to add that in there and do kind of my little bit of shading. There we go. I just feel like that's a little bit more consistent and not so distracting. And then once that ink is dry, erase the pencil marks and do little touch-ups. And then we're all done. I hope you enjoyed seeing part 2 of my little Bumblebee series. Up next, I'll be doing a watercolor version. So again, just showing you kind of some tricks for realism. We've got the contour, we talked about shading, which will help us as we're doing the actual watercolor itself, just to have that kind of modeling in the back of our minds. But I'm really excited to do the watercolor version of this, just another angle of a different Bumblebee, and just gonna help you continue to grow in your artistic abilities. If you're excited for that video, go ahead, give me a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss it. Until next time, happy drawing!